So this morning, men, it's your turn. On Mother's Day, we looked at a recipe for wives. Today is Father's Day, so we have a blueprint for husbands now. I do not leave either group out. We both get our chance in the spotlight, as it were, but we will just looking at the idea that comes from the Bible. And, I've been pointed out, I'm taking a little bit different approach to Mother's Day and Father's Day, talking about wives and husbands instead of mothers and fathers. But biblically speaking, we are to be a husband or a wife first before we are a mother or a father, and those characteristic traits flow into the next. And so I guess kind of from that viewpoint, and hey, I can always say it's my first time doing it. It's my first full year as as doing the ministry work here of coming from the pulpit. So I got room for growth if we want to try other avenues next year. But one aspect and one thought that kind of hits my head, and we've kind of discussed a little bit in Bible study this morning. God has set forth His plan for mankind from the beginning, and He revealed it to us. We need to know what it is and follow it today as much as possible. And as much as possible, we need to remind the world that He does have the plan and what it is. Too many have taken and looked at the Bible and it just sits on bookshelves. It is, at one point, it was the #1 bestseller. I don't know if that's still true today or not. Looking at society, I doubt it, unless there are just enough people that are still following the Bible that have needed to replace theirs or get another copy of one. I would love to see that it is still the top seller, but unfortunately, I'm not holding my breath at this particular moment. Because unfortunately, we need to have a discussion like this of looking at what is the blueprint for husbands. So on this particular day, we will look at that. The very first element that I think about and that I look at, since we know that God gave us this plan from the beginning, is to look at the beginning. So going back to Genesis chapter 2, when He made mankind, we see that man was made from the earth. All things were made from the earth that God created in the first place. He pulled together the dirt and breathed into it the breath of life and called it man. And that man was Adam. And then from there we see that woman was made. All other creatures were made from the dust of the earth, male and female, as far as we know, except for humans. Mankind is the only one that we have identified as being different in this way, in that woman was made from the man. The man was made first. He just identified all of the animals and creatures, and can you imagine having that task? Sitting down for a parade and everything walks past you, you have to give it a name. And then you realize, I have seen everything has a mate except for me. And Adam was put into a deep sleep, bone was taken out, and Adam said in verse 23 of chapter 2, this is now bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. And verse 24 goes into our next key point here, is that now that there is this deep connection between man and woman, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. As a leader, we must be able to lead. A man is to grow beyond being a child of his parents and start looking and leading his own house. Now, Adam had no father and mother to leave at this point, but he is setting the precedence for all mankind from this point forward, is that at some point the child must be grown. They must grow up and develop, and we'll get back to that idea. But once he is grown and he takes on a wife, then he is to leave the umbrella, the arms, the whatever you want to call it, of his parents, Some parents may call it their roof and say, go, spring wings of your own. At this point here, they leave father and mother. Not totally, not turn their back on them and walk away and never see them again. Um, if you want to ask my parents, they'll say that they'd still like me to visit more often than I do, but not necessarily move in with them. I'm sure that they would have plenty of a to-do list for me if I did, but the idea is to grow. Become the leader of your household, become the leader of your family, and have a family of your own as well. We have several verses that are listed here. This verse right here is repeated several times throughout the Bible, and those are listed in the outline. As we look forward to this, and what this means to us is that the husband is to lead the household. Since he leaves father and mother and he is to cling to his wife, what is his next responsibility? In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, which I apparently did not mark, we see where he is to lead his household. 1 Corinthians 11, 1 through 3. Imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ. Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions just as I deliver them to you. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ. The head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. There is a circle here that is to remember. As a leader, you have to remember that you lead others and you serve others. So if we take out the part about the husband here and just focus on what Christ is here, the head of every of every man is Christ. Think of it like a circle. Christ is the head of mankind. Man is to lead the woman, but Christ's head is God. Christ is God, Christ was God, but Christ also left part of that behind when he became man, but he also answered to the Father. Men, we don't get to lead just any old way. We have accountability and responsibility. Our lead is to lead as Christ led, not however we choose. Unfortunately, we see too many men that don't know what leadership is, who don't know what it is to be a man out in the world today, and it is a shame that that has not been trained up and brought up in the upbringing, in the training and admonition of one another. Somewhere, someone has dropped the ball on that. Hopefully, we are not done learning and observing, because Paul here says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Which means, some people are already doing the things that Paul was doing, others may not be. There is room for growth every day. There is always that ability to learn more, to dive deeper into it. To be a good leader, you need to know how to serve. The very end of the lesson here, I'll key in on this since I'm thinking is in my head at the moment. What is it to be as Christ? How is it that Christ is a leader but yet is also a servant? How many times did he parallel those two? He leads such a great multitude every day in his teachings, but yet he also serves them in the process. So men, as we look at being husbands and being the leader of our wife, we also have to know that that means being a servant to her. It is to lead, is to also serve. Look at imitating of Christ. He taught his disciples, though he was a master, yet he came to serve. To be of best service, to be the best, you must learn to serve. Look back in our series on Matthew that we covered that recently. But think about that as we go forward in lives. We also see that as a blueprint for as a husband, the husband is to be responsible. Not just a leader just wandering someplace blindfolded, but it is to be responsible in how it is. We see in the garden that blaming others is not a good characteristic of a leader. The very first time that man and woman do something wrong, and I said man and woman, she may have started it, but he didn't stop it, and he followed along with it. And when God came in Genesis chapter 3 and said, "What has happened?" and he goes, "That woman," pointing the finger over towards someone else and saying, "That woman that you gave me, she came from you and you were to lead. Why didn't you do something?" That is not a good characteristic. That is not being responsible. So the question is, what are we supposed to be? Christ uses the example of a husband as a way to illustrate how the church is and how it should relate to us today. In Ephesians chapter 5, we see this picture that is used and we see how it is displayed. If we can understand the relationship of husband and wife and how Christ is with the church, he parallels the two and kind of puts them up side by side on top of each other. Says, look at how they overlap. Look at how I have given you the plans already. Ephesians chapter 5, starting in verse 25. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle, or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. For we are all members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. As a church, we are bound to Christ. Think of it going back to Adam and Eve. He says that we are of one flesh. We are born out of Christ. He came to this earth, delivered the words for it, died for it, and it began. We are that rib. We have been born out of Christ, and we are part of him. He does not hate his own flesh. The two shall become one. When we are buried with baptism in him, as we look at with verse 26, that he may sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word. When we are baptized into the church, when we are baptized through his words, through the obedience of his word, we are brought into a oneness with Christ. We are brought into this body, into this bond. Think of it like the husband and wife marriage, the bond that we share now as a Christian. It is our lifestyle. It's not a separate thing about us. It is now one. For this reason, we leave the worldly things behind and cleave only to Christ. We let Christ lead us. We are one. He uses this to illustrate the idea of a husband and wife. If we understand as husband and wife, the goal is that we join together and become one flesh. Do we understand the church? How much, husbands, do you love your wives? Wives, how much do you love your husbands? How much do we bond to that person? I realize also in our audience and those who may watch this later, we do have widows. Think about that bond that is there. Think about what it means to become one. And we look at the joyous that it brings, the fun, the great times, the great elements, the improvement that it is to our lives. He says, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself. How many of us starve ourselves? How many of ourselves beat ourselves up? How many of ourselves would go and jump in front of traffic and get hit by a car? Would we do that to ourselves? Then don't do that to our wives. And it's not just about just pushing out into the street and being hit by a car. It's about the mental, it's about the physical, it's about the cherishing, the nourishing, all of these things. As we look at these duties, digging a little deeper into a couple of these verses here, as we look at the duties of a husband, there's only a couple that are actually listed here, but there doesn't need to be many. By no means could this be considered an exhaustive list, but think back to what Christ says. Love God, love your neighbor. All other commandments hinge off of these two. So for us to just put down here that the husband's duty is to love. One word, love. Such a simple word that brings so much with it. As we continue to look here, we can see some of this. But first, defining the word love is an intense feeling of deep affection. We are to love our neighbor. We are to reach out to those around us. We are to love one another. But we are also to love our wife. The husband's focus should be so strong towards his wife, just as Christ was to the church. Looking back at verse 25, emphasized it when I said it the first time, but I'll emphasize it again. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. He loved the church so much that he left his place in heaven to come to earth to give us the words by which we need to live by. He then loved us so much that he put up with the ridicule. He put up with the torments. He put up with what we're about to study in Matthew as he heads to the cross. And yes, he even put up with the cross itself, being killed. He put his life for us. Are we willing to sacrifice for our wives? How many times throughout history or throughout whatever do we see where there might be a husband and wife and the husband gets in front of the wife in the case of danger, puts his own life on the line to protect his wife? Christ did that for us. I think it could be even simpler than that. It could be the gesture of it. Are we willing to sacrifice of ourselves? Are we willing to forego buying the next big toy or the next big thing to put food on the table, to put a roof over the head? Are we willing to sacrifice maybe even our time so that we might spend time with our wives? I will say that last week I missed being here with everyone, but I also enjoyed spending time with my wife on vacation. We were able to sneak that in early because with everything going on, with the work schedule and everything, time was not being sacrificed much for my wife the last month or two. And the next month, look forward, is going to be a little tight as well. But we found some time, and we sacrificed it out from something else to time together. Do we sacrifice one for another? Do we allow ourselves to love that deeply that we let go of something ourselves? We have to remember as well that in this love that husbands and wives are one flesh. We might be two individual bodies, but we are bound together as one. So to nourish and cherish her as your own, as it showed from verses 28 to 31. What do we do with our own bodies? Do we treat ourselves pretty good? do we treat our wives even better? In that love, do we also stop to feel that love come back to us? As a husband, as love goes, love is a two-way street. It needs to go both ways to be fully appreciated, to be fully enjoyed. And so, as we look at it, receive the love from your wife. Verse 33 says, "Let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband." Do we receive that one from another? And as a part of this, something to consider and think about, and that needs to be said in this day and time. I say that, but looking through the history of the Bible, it can be said at any point in time. The affectionate love is to be shared only between the husband and the wife. Looking back, 1 Corinthians 7, verses 1 through 5. "Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife. Let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to the wife the affection due her, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourself to fasting and prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." The Bible talks about our affectionate needs, the physical needs and things of the body, and we are to save that for our own spouse, for our own wives, for our own husbands, whether you are a wife or a husband. Love your wife, not anyone and everyone. Keep that love where it belongs, in God's plan. It's sad to have to say that. It's unfortunate to have to say that so pointedly, but look at the world that we're in. Look at the world that's always been. When we stray away from God's word, anything goes. Think of the things that were discussed this morning in Bible study with the impending doom of Sodom and Gomorrah, of what they were even doing. Keep it at home. Wait for it to be a home, and then keep it at home. As we go through love, we also remember and we see the idea here that we do not provoke others either. This is getting more towards the idea of a father. But as we look at Ephesians, going into chapter 6, we start to see the example of the lifestyle of, now we include children into this. And we see, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth." Now that takes a whole new meaning if you go back to the Old Testament about being stoned. But in the New Testament, it is also an idea of a lifestyle. We live a longer life if we're happy. Go look at medical reports, look at the different journals, look at the different research. The happier a person is, the longer their lifespan can be. Start from childhood. Be happy. Don't agitate your parents. It doesn't always end well. But we also look at verse 4 as it starts to focus in. "And you, fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath." We'll finish that verse in a moment. Given the example and lifestyles of Christ, no one should ever provoke another to wrath. Look at how Christ dealt with controversy. How did Christ deal with the issues that showed up? He never once brought someone to wrath. Oh, now there are quite a few that got very indignant, but it was not because of Christ. It was their own internal doings. The specific example here is raising children because of discipline is to be given to aid in our next duty, the remainder of that verse. But as we give discipline, as we give that encouragement or that upbringing, we don't go to the excess of going to wrath. As we finish verse 4, it says, "But bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord." So a duty of a father, of a husband, is to be a builder and an example. How do we do this? How do we bring someone up in the training and admonition of the Lord? We have several examples here of this. We'll bring them up. The children do have physical and mental needs that must be met to grow. Bring them up. Help them to grow. Sometimes that means letting them fall and skin their knee. But are we there to help encourage them back up? Are we there to assist them and show them the way? If we never give them any time or attention, will they develop? Maybe, very slowly. If we help them, it comes quicker. Training of the Lord. Just looking at the word of training is now we are to train them, but we're also to train them of the Lord. We can't forget that part. Unfortunately, families seem to have forgotten that. We don't do as much of the Lord. Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night is not Bible training. It is not training of the Lord. That is to be done at the home. This is our fellowship and communion one with another, where we do go into Bible studies. We do learn more as a group. But we have to come with knowledge and ability before we go forward so that we can learn more. We can get the most out of it. So training of the Lord, teach them by the Bible of what God expects of us. What is it that we are to do to be acceptable? Why are we not mean to other people? Why don't we cheat and steal? Because Christ gives us a different example. Christ gives us the promises of if we follow his example, we have a place waiting for us. We can show all of this. We can show what's being taught in schools from the Bible, whether it's true or not. The other part of that last part is we are also to admonish them through the Lord. We now get to teach by example what we do to be pleasing to God. Which means please don't use the phrase, "do as I say, not as I do." How many times were the scribes and Pharisees pointed out for that one? Now, nowhere do I see that phrase, but I equate that into their lifestyle. They are standing there telling everyone what to do while the whole time they're just making a show of themselves and not doing it themselves. Why are they so mad at what Christ is saying? Because they're not doing it themselves. Christ gave us the example. He taught it and he showed it. He trained and admonished in the Lord. Do we do the same thing in our houses? As husbands, as fathers, do we do the same? All of this must be done through love and never go to the point of provoking to wrath. Now, there's probably no way around the little child that just got told, "No, you can't have another piece of chocolate cake. I hate you." Well, that's not provoked to wrath. That's just a little fit. This is where training and admonition comes in. But we don't escalate it to wrath. We love. They may not realize that eating an entire chocolate cake at one sitting is not good for them. Through training, they'll understand eventually. The blueprint for all of God's creation is to be of one mind and to follow him. Just as we concluded the mother's the Mother's Day sermon with this verse, I think it's very fitting to do that again. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. Finally, all of you be of one mind, having compassion for one another, love as brothers, be tender-hearted, be courteous, not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, blessings, knowing that you are called to this, that you may inherit a blessing. Do we live our lives in such a fashion? Living just that verse right there can apply to any person. Husbands, wives, children, parents, anyone. And we can be pleasing unto God. Do we follow this blueprint? But this is just the starting point for it. As I kind of mentioned at the beginning, thinking here for the deeper study, to look into what it means to love, what it means to have this kind of blueprint, look at what it means through the scriptures to be as Christ. Those two little words. Really, that one little word, as. To be as Christ. Christ is the head of the church as the husband is head of the wife. Husbands, when we look at the Bible, and we look at them, kind of hold it up to the mirror as like our mirror, are we reflecting what is on these pages? That goes for any person, not just husbands. As we look at the Bible itself, are we as Christ? Paul was able to say, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. Will others see Christ in us? Whether we're fulfilling the role of the husband or of any other role in life. Are we as Christ? If we are not, if we need to be baptized into Him, the invitation is open for any that need to join as one to be with Christ. If we are with Christ and we need to come back to Him because we have separated out, the invitation is open. Do we need assistance along the way? Do we need to remember what it is to love so deeply that we might sacrifice for another? If there are needs of the invitation, we offer them now and invite anyone to come while we together stand.